The terrace of their hillside house looked straight out over the bay, wide, like an exhibition, with rows of muted lights, neatly arranged chairs, and green plants in concrete vases. The house itself was a statement: glass, cold concrete, warm cedar, all combined to seem both open and closed at once. Guests, stepping on the marble, seemed to enter a microcosm where every object had its place and meaning. For the guests, it was all evening decoration. For the hosts, it was a nameplate they were proud of and sometimes neglected. Aaron Stanford stood by the railing, holding a glass of Merlot, looking down at the city. The string lights cast shimmering spots on his fingers. In the glass, a dark, almost purple sparkle, but he did not drink. He had learned to be an observer. Years of designing bridges and residential complexes had taught him calm distance, the ability to spot inconsistencies and calculate loads. Tonight, he was not counting beams or calculations. He was counting pauses, glances, and the distances between people. Jazz flowed softly from the DJ booth, waves meant to warm the room. Instead, the music felt like a line, background that only emphasized the emptiness inside. People laughed, exchanging jokes and toasts, but their laughter belonged to the same category as the designer vases: beautiful, convenient, requiring no participation. They did not notice how the house breathed, how the walls reflected conversations and filed them into neat sections of memory. Macy Stanford, moved among the guests as if it were her stage. The dress was perfect, deep sapphire velvet, a neckline that promised but did not reveal, and a train as light as a breath. She was confident in everything she did, in her laughter, in her nod, in the way she handed a glass so it ended up in the right hand. People laughed with her and for her. Investors nodded. Journalists pretended to listen, and all of it gave the evening a glossy texture. Aaron saw her from another angle, not as an image, but as a set of movements. He remembered the woman he had spent 10 years with. She had been different, softer, able to call him by name and wait for him to come home. Now, she was a costume, a polished role, a carefully chosen scene. And in that dress, amid the light and words, there was something less than love, a light, almost scientific detachment from life. He did not think of betrayal in the usual sense. For him, it was not a loud scandal with broken dishes and accusations. Betrayal, for him, manifested differently. In microgestures, in the desynchronization of breaths, in the way one of the two melodies in a duet no longer matched the other. He had learned to read such things as he did blueprints. Lines do not lie, if you look closely enough. Jason Harper appeared on the terrace at the moment when conversations were flowing into light intrigue. He was younger than Aaron, neat, with a thin scar near his temple that seemed to add to his charisma, and a way of holding himself as if every gesture was calculated for effect. He was skilled in words, in smiles, and in placing himself at the center of attention without visible effort. He was an investor, a man of business and charm. He could talk about projects as if he were sharing his own feelings. They exchanged a brief greeting, even businesslike, without a hint of warmth. Macy offered her hand to Jason, and in that moment, significant and telling, something happened that Aaron had long feared and expected to see. Their bodies touched, and the contact lasted a fraction of a moment longer than propriety required. It was not an embrace, not an overt scene. It was that very pause from which reality is built. Jason's hand, with a light, almost imperceptible movement, settled on the small of Macy's back. His thumb made a tiny circle on the fabric. Nothing to the onlookers, everything to those who knew how to read. 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, everything was contained: acknowledgement, attraction, the promise of what follows eye contact and closeness. 2 seconds, and Aaron heard his own breath as if it were the only sound. Everything else receded. The jazz became a rustle, the laughter a background, the glasses static objects. The world narrowed to the line where hand and waist met. He did not make a sudden move. There was no shout, no thrown cup, no accusations. He simply allowed himself to feel what he felt, not sharp pain, but cold clarity. It was like reading a budget, when you suddenly see that one column does not add up, and you realize that the structure will collapse if you do not intervene. But intervention required a loud scene, and Aaron already knew the outcome of such a performance. Macy was a master of performance. She could turn any truth on its head, making herself appear the victim of misunderstanding. His decision was born instantly and quietly, not to fight for a show, not to make a scandal. He was tired of public confrontations, of the stage where they both appeared not as people, but as conventions. He wanted only one thing: to leave in such a way that there would be no point in asking, to leave symbols that told the truth not with words, but with fact. He chose to become a disappearance, not a scandal. It was the worst, but in a way the most honest form of revenge, silence filled with meaning. He took a step back, as if retreating into the drawing room of his life. The movement was almost imperceptible. He closed his eyes, inhaled, and returned to the area where he was supposed to be the host. His smile was stretched, like carefully ironed fabric, even, correct, without sparks. Macy glanced in his direction, a fleeting, polite look, and he saw in her the woman he knew socially, but not personally. She was the perfect hostess, agile, quick, knowing when to laugh. She did not see, or pretended not to see, that her husband was no longer on stage with her. He stood in the shadows and watched them from the side. That evening, the guests talked about profitable deals and upcoming releases, about rewards and public recognition, conversations that kept people in a neutral state of comfort. Here, people exchanged connections, not hearts. And at the center of this exchange stood a woman whose glances now sought not genuine closeness, but confirmation of her own importance. Aaron moved aside, to the glass partition, where the cold glass reflected the terrace, faces, light, movement, and among them, his own, diminished, transparent, like an overlay on someone else's scene. He felt like an object in a display case, visible, but not touching the essence. He remembered how he had once loved Macy for the inner truth she could show only to him. Now, that truth had passed through another filter. It had become public, malleable, and controlled. He spoke to no one. His language was observation. In one corner, Jason was telling a joke, a long, calculated story with hints of success. In another, a woman Aaron considered a friend was talking about a new project and looking literally past him, as if he were part of the decor. The world moved, but every detail became proof that the fabric of their marriage had changed, lost its density and cohesion. Aaron thought about how easily truth can be hidden. Truth fits into a second, into a touch, a glance, a silence. And if he were to shout now, to say loudly what burned in his chest, people would either not understand or believe the facade. He knew that in a public saga, performance defeats fact. So he chose a different tactic: to remain cold, to count, to plan. The disappearance he had chosen required time and precision, like a project, and in this lay his confidence. The music played its unobtrusive role, glasses clinked, people changed topics, and all this time, Aaron kept his decision inside, like a draft that could still be revised. He felt not heat, but icy clarity rising in his chest. There was no revenge in it, no repentance. There was only the understanding that sometimes silence is louder than any word, and it leaves a mark that cannot be erased. When the conversation moved to other guests, when someone's voices crossed and dissolved into the air, Macy approached the window, smiling at Jason, and in her smile Aaron saw an image that did not belong to the two of them. He gave in to an old habit, looking closely at the details, and noticed that the bookmark in her hand had shifted, as if she were holding a fake object, not a book. Macy's whole life now looked like a carefully staged performance, and in this performance, his role had become marginal. The night wore on, guests dispersed and mingled again, and Aaron stood by the glass, counting steps, glances, touches. He planned his departure like an engineer designing a bridge, calculated, without drama, with the understanding that destruction is sometimes a way of preserving the integrity of the soul. He knew that by choosing silence, he would deny her the chance to turn the situation into a spectacle against him. He would leave her the stage, but without the audience for whom she had done it all. Behind the wall, where the light dimmed, the music became just background. He took a deep breath, carefully placed the glass in the sink, as if returning a prop to its place, and walked into the small corridor leading to the study. The door closed softly, like an archive drawer, without drama, but inevitably. There, in the silence, he would begin to write. Not a scream, not an ode. A letter that would become a mirror for her, not an accusation, but a fact, built from dates, moments, and silences. A letter she would receive too late, if she received it at all. That evening, the bay seemed distant and coldly glittered with stars. Their house continued to stand, smooth and sleek, like a model. Inside, between the chairs and glass, beneath the layer of social varnish, a void was being born that protective layers could not conceal. And Aaron, closing the study door behind him, already knew. This evening would mark the beginning of the end of their theatrical marriage. A quiet, precise, calculated fall that would later be whispered about at business lunches, but never truly understood. Morning began as usual, but there was a feeling that something in the house had shifted. Alex noticed it immediately, even before Lena came out of the bedroom. The kitchen smelled of coffee, but there was no sense of homeliness he had grown used to over the years of living together. He sat at the table, looking out the window, trying to convince himself that yesterday's gesture had been just friendly, insignificant. But the memory resurfaced again and again, as if someone were deliberately pressing repeat. When Lena appeared in the kitchen, she looked a little sleepy and absent-minded, as if she hadn't slept well, though she usually woke up before him. She greeted him and immediately reached for the coffee maker. Alex watched her, trying to catch something unusual, behavior, intonation, a glance. But everything seemed normal, and that only made it more unsettling. "Have you been up long?" she asked. "Not long," he replied, though he had woken up long before her. The conversation was short, almost formal. They talked about work, about the weather, but not about what really troubled Alex. He wanted to ask, who was the man yesterday, and why had her hand lingered there, on the edge of what was allowed? But the words seemed to stick in his throat. He was afraid to hear the answer that would change everything. The day passed slowly. Alex tried to focus on work, but his thoughts kept returning to Lena. He remembered her look at dinner, how she had barely paid attention to him, as if she were occupied with something else entirely. He tried to explain it away as stress, projects, burnout, anything but the thought that caused real pain. When Lena returned in the evening, he noticed that she looked at him less. Her short answers, her eagerness to retreat to the bedroom under the pretense of tiredness, her calmness, all of it seemed to confirm the suspicions he did not want to develop. Alex watched her and at some point realized an invisible distance had arisen between them, and that distance grew every day. He tried to find a reason to talk, but something always stopped him. He waited for her to start, but she, on the contrary, seemed to avoid any topics that might lead to real questions. At night, Alex lay awake for a long time. Beside him, Lena breathed, calm and detached. He stared into the darkness and thought about how everything had changed imperceptibly, not loudly, not abruptly, but almost at the level of silence. And it was this silence that troubled him most. It felt like a pause before something that would have to be heard sooner or later. He understood that sooner or later this conversation would be necessary, but he did not know how to approach it. And, perhaps, deep down, he already guessed that the answers that would come would not please either of them. Morning came with gray light filtering through the blinds. Michael stood by the window of his Chicago apartment, holding a nearly cold cup of coffee, trying to gather his thoughts. He saw the street, heard the hum of cars and the occasional footsteps of passers-by, but it seemed as if the whole world around him had slowed down, frozen in anticipation. Inside him, everything was boiling, as if an invisible storm was raging in every inch of his consciousness. He replayed last night's dinner in his mind again. Lisa laughed, told stories about colleagues. Their light jokes sounded like a treacherous noise to him. And there was that moment, that short, almost imperceptible moment, when her hand touched the man's back, a smile in her eyes, a look full of quiet intimacy that did not belong to him. He saw how she pulled back, as if she hadn't noticed her own gesture, but Michael knew the truth. He saw comfort where there should have been only him. He remembered how he had tried to hide his confusion, how he had sat in the living room, pretending everything was normal, smiling in response to jokes, inhaling the scent of her perfume and coffee, and each time feeling his heart tighten. He did not want to make a scene. He understood. If he lost it now, she would not hear his pain, she would only twist the words to make him seem crazy. When Lisa returned home the next morning, he watched her every move, every gesture. She walked through the apartment with confident steps, as if nothing had happened. But Michael saw the subtle signs, how she checked her phone, how her gaze lingered slightly on the mirror, how she quickly passed by the kitchen without stopping. He was silent, observing, recording every movement, every glance she cast at him, as if he were filming a movie himself. In the evening, the tension reached its limit. Michael sat in the armchair, his hands gripping the edges of the armrests. Lisa approached, tried to talk about weekend plans, but he barely listened. His inner voice repeated, "You see this, you can't pretend you don't." And he realized that silence would become his weapon. He would not shout, would not accuse. He would simply create a space in which she would feel the loss of control. When she went to the bedroom, he stood up, approached the wall with paintings, photographs of their past travels. Each photo now seemed like an act of deception. Her smile, her trusting look, which no longer existed. He understood that the home, which had been their refuge, had now become a place of observation, an arena for a silent game. The night passed in thought. Michael looked out at the city from the window, heard the rain tapping on the glass, and it seemed that every drop reflected his thoughts, his anxiety, and his growing resolve. He knew that his next actions had to be precise, like a well-designed building. Every step, every detail mattered. And somewhere deep in his soul, he understood that tomorrow everything would change. It no longer mattered how much she would try to hide or pretend. That moment last night had been a turning point. Michael was no longer just a husband. He was an observer, the architect of his own retreat, and the shadow Lisa had left was now his map. The next morning greeted Michael with cold light breaking through the gray clouds. He woke up earlier than usual, feeling a strange satisfaction from the control that was now beginning to manifest in the little things. He quietly left the bedroom, not closing the door, so Lisa would not suspect anything. In the kitchen, her usual coffee scent had not yet filled the room because Michael had already placed only an empty cup on the table. He had carefully removed her favorite coffee, leaving only instant. Lisa entered the room, leaning on the table, her eyes still sleepy, but expecting the usual morning. "Where's my coffee?" she asked, trying not to show irritation. "No, Lisa. Today it's simple." His voice was soft, almost imperceptibly cold. "I decided to change the morning." Her brows furrowed, but she said nothing, smiling awkwardly. She did not understand that this was only the first step. The first step in a chain of changes that Michael had planned with the precision of an architect. Every action of his was calculated. He could not afford mistakes, and she had not yet noticed that the familiar rhythm of their life was crumbling. He watched as she took the cup, tasted the drink, and winced. The slightest discomfort, which had previously been insignificant, now became a signal. His silent strategy was working. Lisa, used to the world obeying her control, for the first time felt something slipping away. Throughout the day, Michael continued his quiet manipulations. He did not respond to Lisa's messages immediately, left small things out of place, subtly changed the routes of her usual movement around the house. Everything happened within the framework of seemingly ordinary life, but each change left a mark, a feeling of instability, a slight anxiety that could not be explained rationally. Lisa began to get nervous. Her usual meetings with colleagues, calls, and meetings did not bring comfort. She felt a strange emptiness in the house, as if someone invisible was changing the familiar rhythm of their life together. Michael, watching her, felt an inner victory. He had created a space where Lisa could no longer dominate without obstacles. In the evening, Michael approached the letter again. It remained neatly hidden, but its significance grew. He imagined how Lisa would discover it, how she would feel the cold he had put into every word. He was not in a hurry. He knew that patience would be the key. When Lisa sat down for dinner, her gaze again lingered on the empty space on the kitchen shelf, where familiar things usually stood. She felt a slight irritation, but could not pinpoint the cause. Her habit of controlling everything was failing for the first time in years. "Michael," she said cautiously, "is everything okay today?" "Yes," he said calmly. "Everything is exactly as it should be." But in his eyes there was a fire, quiet, invisible, speaking of the fact that the game was just beginning. Michael understood that tomorrow there would be a new step, a step that would no longer allow Lisa to doubt. The psychological distance he had created today would become the basis for the final resolution. And as the rain quietly beat against the windows of their home, Lisa felt for the first time that the familiar world was beginning to crumble. She did not yet know that the one who had seemed quiet and devoted had already become the architect of her anxiety. The house was shrouded in twilight. The warm light of the lamps, reflecting in the glass walls, created the illusion of coziness, but Michael felt the cold of inner emptiness. He knew that the game he had started 5 weeks ago was about to end. Lisa entered, holding her bag. Her face showed fatigue and a slight anxiety, signs that the constant feeling of discomfort that Michael had carefully maintained was beginning to take effect. She sat on the sofa, not taking off her coat, and looked at him as if trying for the first time to understand who this person in front of her was. Michael. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. What's going on? He approached slowly, leaving a pause to let the tension grow. In his hands, he held a small envelope, neatly wrapped in cream-colored paper. This is for you, Lisa. He placed the envelope in front of her on the table. You need to see this for yourself. Her fingers trembled as she took the envelope. Michael silently watched every movement, knowing that she would feel what he had put into these weeks. Cold, loss of control, the realization of her own vulnerability. She unfolded the paper. At first, her gaze slid over the neat letters, written in blocks, without unnecessary emotionality. Each word was a cold point, precise and accurate. Michael, this. She could not finish the sentence. He sat down beside her, not touching, allowing her to feel the full weight of the moment. The letter unfolded before her like a mirror. Her mistakes, her inability to see the person next to her, her life built on illusions. I didn't run away from you, he said quietly. I disappeared for you, to show you what it means to be invisible. Everything else, your choices, Lisa. Tears welled in her eyes as she read about each day he had lived, watching her, her habits, her attention to details that never concerned him. She realized that she had lost not him, but herself, the Lisa who thought she was in control. I didn't know. Her voice trembled. I thought I knew you. No, he replied gently. You only knew what you wanted to see. Michael stood up, gathered his things, and turned toward the door. His figure stood in the doorway, tall and confident. He was no longer part of her game, and this feeling of final freedom was palpable in every movement. Goodbye, Lisa. And remember, sometimes an invisible lesson is stronger than any scream. He walked out into the evening rain, quietly closing the door behind him. Lisa remained alone in the glass house, surrounded by familiar things that now seemed foreign. Her heart beat anxiously, but for the first time she understood that she had lost not only a man, but the illusion of her own control. She sat on the sofa, the letter still in her hands. The rain outside intensified, beating against the glass with a rhythm that was no longer hers. Lisa felt the emptiness for the first time in many years, an emptiness that could not be filled by work, manipulation, or new relationships. And then, for the first time in a long time, she looked at herself and saw reality, that she was the one who had built walls around real life, and now those walls were crumbling. Michael left, but his shadow remained, not as a threat, but as a reminder. Sometimes silence is stronger than words, disappearance more powerful than presence, and seeing the invisible is the only way to understand the true.